There are moments in life when we stand at a crossroads, unsure of what's ahead. We make plans, set goals, and try to figure everything out, only to face unexpected detours, delays, and disappointments. But while we may struggle to understand, God already knows the destination. His plan is bigger than our understanding, and when we trust Him, we learn that every step, whether forward, backward, or seemingly stuck in place, is leading us exactly where we need to be. Think about Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, a vision of leadership, but what followed was anything but a direct path to success. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison, his reality looked nothing like the promise God had given him. Yet every single trial, every painful experience was part of God's plan to place him in a position of power at the perfect time. If Joseph had tried to open his own doors, he would have settled for less. But because he trusted God's process, he was eventually placed in a position where his gift not only elevated him, but also saved an entire nation. Sometimes we get frustrated when things don't go our way, but have you ever stopped to think that maybe God is protecting you? Maybe the job you didn't get wasn't the right fit. Maybe the relationship that ended was saving you from heartache. Maybe the opportunity that passed you by wasn't the best He had for you. We only see one piece of the puzzle, but God sees the full picture. And because He loves us, He won't allow us to walk through doors that will lead us away from our purpose. The enemy wants you to doubt, to fear, to question whether God has forgotten about you. But faith means trusting that God is working even when you don't see the evidence yet. Just because things aren't happening on your timeline doesn't mean they aren't happening. You may not understand why certain things are unfolding the way they are, but if you keep your faith, you will look back one day and realize that every delay, every closed door, and every unexpected turn was leading you to something greater than you ever imagined. Abraham had to trust God's plan without seeing the details. God told him to leave everything familiar and step into the unknown with only a promise to hold on to. No map, no guarantees, just faith. And because he believed, God made him the father of many nations. Had he stayed where he was comfortable, he would have missed out on the promise. But obedience to God's direction led him to the fulfillment of something far greater than he could have planned for himself. Your future is not in your hands, it's in God's. And when you learn to trust Him, you stop stressing over things that are out of your control. You stop trying to force what was never meant for you. You stop worrying about when, how, or if something will happen, because when you walk with God, you can rest in the truth that He is leading you exactly where you need to go, and the right doors will open in His perfect time. Rejection is one of the hardest things to experience. Whether it's a job you didn't get, a relationship that ended, or an opportunity that slipped through your fingers, rejection has a way of making you question your worth. It can leave you feeling discouraged, unwanted, and uncertain about what's next. But what if rejection wasn't meant to break you? What if it was actually God's way of redirecting you towards something greater? Sometimes the doors that close in our faces are the very things saving us from walking into a place that was never meant for us. We see it as failure, but God sees it as protection. When you trust Him, you begin to understand that rejection is not the end of the road. It's simply a sign that you were never supposed to settle there in the first place. God has something better, and when you stop fighting for what He has already removed, you position yourself to receive what He truly has for you. Think about David. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house to anoint the next king, David wasn't even considered. His own father didn't invite him to stand among his brothers. From the outside, it looked like rejection. It looked like he was overlooked and forgotten. But while others saw a shepherd boy, God saw a king. The rejection of man didn't stop the plan of God. David's anointing was reserved for him, and nothing could take it away. That's what we have to understand. Just because someone else rejects you doesn't mean God has. Just because a person, a company, or a situation tells you no doesn't mean you're not called, chosen, or worthy. Sometimes God will allow rejection to happen because He knows that if you stayed where you were, it would limit you. If you remained in that comfort zone, you would never grow into what He created you to be. Joseph experienced this too. When his brothers threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery, it was rejection at its worst. But what they meant for harm, God used for good. If Joseph had never been rejected by his family, he never would have made it to Egypt. If he had never been thrown into prison, he never would have met the cupbearer. If he had never been forgotten for 2 more years, he wouldn't have been positioned at the exact time Pharaoh needed an interpreter. Every rejection in Joseph's life was actually divine redirection, pushing him closer to the place where God had called him to be. When something doesn't work out the way you expected, don't waste time crying over a closed door. Instead, ask God what He's trying to show you. Ask Him where He's leading you, because the moment you shift your perspective, you'll realize that rejection is not a curse, it's a blessing in disguise. It's not meant to destroy you, it's meant to develop you. And when you trust that every no is simply leading you to a better yes, you'll stop worrying about the past and start walking boldly into the future God has already prepared for you. Waiting is one of the hardest things to do. When you know God has placed something in your heart, when you've prayed, believed, and done everything you know to do, yet nothing seems to be moving, it can be frustrating. It can feel like God has forgotten about you, like He's ignoring your prayers, or worse, like He's blessing everyone else while leaving you behind. But the truth is, God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't match your own. There is a reason why certain things haven't happened yet. There is a reason why doors haven't opened and why prayers haven't been answered the way you expected. It's not because God is denying you, it's because He is preparing you. See, we want quick results, but God is more concerned with the process. He knows that if you step into something too soon, you won't be able to handle it. A blessing given at the wrong time can become a burden. That's why He allows the waiting season not to frustrate you, but to develop you, to strengthen your faith, and to position you for what He has in store. Look at the life of Sarah and Abraham. God promised them a child, but years went by and nothing happened. In their impatience, they tried to take matters into their own hands, and as a result, they ended up with Ishmael when God had always intended to give them Isaac. How many times have we done the same thing? How many times have we forced something that wasn't meant for us, only to end up with unnecessary pain and regret? When we move ahead of God, we create problems instead of solutions. But when we wait, when we trust, when we believe that God knows what He's doing, we allow Him to bring the promise to pass in a way that is far greater than we ever imagined. David was anointed king as a young man, but he didn't step into the throne immediately. He spent years in the wilderness, running from Saul, facing battles, and enduring hardship. But all of it was preparing him for his reign. If he had become king too soon, he wouldn't have been ready. The same is true for you. Just because God has promised you something doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. The waiting is where He builds your character, where He shapes you, where He teaches you to rely on Him and not on your own strength. The enemy wants you to believe that waiting means nothing is happening, but that's a lie. God is always working behind the scenes. Even when you can't see it, even when you don't feel it, He is aligning things, moving people, orchestrating events, and preparing the way for what He has planned. Your job is not to figure out how or when, it's simply to trust. Because when God moves, He moves suddenly. And when the right door opens, you will step into it knowing that you didn't have to force it, manipulate it, or fight for it. It will be clear that it was God all along. Sometimes we stand in front of doors that were never meant to be opened, pushing and pulling, trying to force our way in. We think we know what's best. We believe we have it all figured out. But the truth is, our understanding is limited. We don't see the full picture the way God does. And when we move ahead of Him, when we try to take control instead of surrendering, we often find ourselves frustrated, exhausted, and disappointed. But when we choose obedience, when we let go of our own plans and follow God's direction, we position ourselves to receive His best. There is power in obedience. The Bible tells us that obedience is better than sacrifice. That means God isn't just looking for people who give, serve, or even pray. He's looking for people who will follow His instructions, even when they don't make sense, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it requires us to step outside of our comfort zone, because obedience is the key that unlocks the doors God has prepared for us. Think about Noah. God told him to build an ark at a time when there was no sign of rain. Imagine how foolish he must have looked to everyone around him. Imagine the criticism, the laughter, the mockery. But Noah didn't allow public opinion to override divine instruction. He obeyed, even when he didn't understand. And because of his obedience, his entire family was saved. How many of us are missing out on God's blessings because we refuse to obey? How many times has God told us to walk away from something, but we held on instead? How many times has He told us to move, but we stayed still out of fear? When God gives you a word, He's not asking for your opinion. He's looking for your obedience, because He knows what's ahead. He knows what you need, and He knows that if you follow Him, He will lead you to something far greater than you could have imagined. Look at Peter. He and the other disciples had been fishing all night and caught nothing. Then Jesus told them to cast their nets again. Peter could have argued. He could have said, "Lord, we've been doing this all night. We're tired. We're experienced fishermen. We know when the fish aren't biting." But instead of relying on his own knowledge, Peter obeyed. And the result? A miracle. A net so full that it began to break. That's what happens when you follow God's lead. You don't have to force things to happen. You don't have to manipulate your way into opportunities. When God opens a door, it won't require you to beg, struggle, or compromise. All He asks is that you trust Him enough to walk in obedience. If God is telling you to wait, wait. If He's telling you to move, move. If He's closing a door, stop trying to reopen it. Because when you walk in obedience, you will always find yourself exactly where you're supposed to be, right in the center of God's perfect plan. Fear has a way of paralyzing us. It whispers lies, telling us we're not good enough, that we'll fail, that things will never work out. It convinces us to settle for less than what God has for us because stepping into the unknown feels too risky. But faith requires movement. You cannot walk through the doors God has opened for you if you're too afraid to take the first step. Fear will keep you standing still when God is calling you forward. Many times we hesitate because we want certainty. We want God to lay out every detail before we move. We want a guarantee that everything will work out perfectly. But that's not how faith works. Faith is stepping out when you don't have all the answers. Faith is believing in God's promises even when your circumstances look the opposite. Faith is trusting that if God opened the door, He will also give you the strength, the wisdom, and the provision to walk through it. Look at the Israelites when they stood at the edge of the Red Sea. Behind them was Pharaoh's army, and in front of them was an impossible barrier. They were terrified. They cried out to Moses, asking why he had led them into what seemed like a trap. But what did God say? Move forward, not wait, not run back, move forward. And the moment they obeyed, the waters parted. The way was made. But they had to step forward first. How many times have you been standing in front of a situation, unsure of what to do, paralyzed by fear? God is saying the same thing to you. Move forward. Stop waiting for everything to be perfect. Stop waiting for all the conditions to align before you step out. Sometimes the breakthrough comes after the step, not before it. The waters didn't part until they moved. And sometimes the miracle you need is waiting on the other side of your obedience. Peter had to learn this lesson too. When he saw Jesus walking on water, he asked if he could come to him. Jesus said, "Come." But Peter had a choice: stay in the boat where it was safe or step out onto the waves. The storm was still raging. The wind was still blowing. But Peter made the choice to step out, and as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he did the impossible. He walked on water. That is what faith does. It allows you to do what others think is impossible. It allows you to move forward when everything says you should retreat. The enemy wants you to believe that the obstacles in front of you are too big, that you're not qualified, that you'll sink. But if God has called you, if He has opened the door, He will also sustain you. You don't have to do it in your own strength. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take the step, because when you do, you will see that God has already made a way. One of the greatest struggles we face is learning to trust God's process. We want things to happen quickly. We want doors to open immediately, but God doesn't operate on our timeline. He is never in a rush, yet He is never late. His timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our expectations. And when we truly understand this, we stop worrying, we stop striving, and we learn to rest in His plan. And we learn to rest in His plan. Waiting on God is not about doing nothing. It's about positioning yourself for what He is preparing. When a farmer plants a seed, he doesn't dig it up every day to check if it's growing. He trusts the process. He waters it, nurtures it, and waits, knowing that in due season it will break through the soil and bear fruit. But many of us struggle to trust God in this way. We plant the seed of faith, but when we don't see immediate results, we panic. We doubt, we try to force things to happen, and in doing so, we risk stepping outside of God's will. Look at Joseph. He had a dream that he would be a ruler, but instead of stepping into that promise right away, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. If you only looked at that part of his story, you would think God had forgotten him. But God was working behind the scenes. Every setback was actually a setup. Every delay was building him, strengthening him, preparing him for the position he would one day walk into. And when the time was right, Joseph went from the prison to the palace in a single day. That's how God works. What looks like a delay is often divine preparation. What looks like rejection is often God's protection. He closes doors that are not meant for you because He has something better in store. And if you trust Him, if you refuse to let frustration push you into making your own way, you will see His plan unfold in ways you never imagined. Think about Jesus. When Mary and Martha sent word that their brother Lazarus was sick, they expected Jesus to come immediately, but He didn't. He waited. And by the time He arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. From their perspective, it was too late. But Jesus knew something they didn't. He wasn't just going to heal Lazarus, He was going to raise him from the dead. The delay wasn't a denial, it was an opportunity for a greater miracle. That's what you have to remember when things aren't happening as fast as you want. God isn't ignoring you. He hasn't forgotten about you. He is setting things up for something greater than you expected. So don't let worry consume you. Don't let impatience push you into something you weren't meant to walk into. Trust that when the right door opens, it will be undeniable. It won't require you to force it, manipulate it, or fight for it. It will be clear that it was God all along.